a lot of questions were raised about the kind of activities that the CSR money was, Gmpc CSR money was going into. But if I recall, if I have a copy of the said memo on this Acca Energy deal, which definitely did not go through. The $1.3 billion was for acquiring Acca's interest, and $350 million was for development cost of Pecan Phase 1.
That's the share of Gmpc in the development cost, correct?
And the justification of the Minister of Energy was that it's quoted that more experience is needed for the exploration of Gmpc's agenda, and in fact, to the extent that Exploco had to be involved in the energy transition process, so it was key that this deal had to go through.
No, I'm sorry, absolutely not. I mean, I don't think that those justifications hold any water whatsoever. Apart from anything else, frankly, Acca, as Acca, a separate company, did not have the kind of technical capability that it could effectively transfer to Gmpc.
They didn't have the technical.
They did not have it because Acca, in the context of what they're doing in the North Sea, they work with BP. They have a joint venture with BP, and the operator is BP, not Acca. So this Ghana operation was the first context in which Acca was going to be an operator. And frankly, I cannot see why Gmpc could not, have that capacity. And frankly, this distinction, Exploco, Gmpc, I don't think it's so important. We should look at them all as Gmpc. Gmpc and the capacity that they had and the ability that they had, either with any new partner or by themselves, bringing in whatever technical services they needed, would have been able to spend this 1.3 billion in a more effective way, in my opinion. Rather than hand it over and then 300 million is supposed to be used for the development. If Acca did not want to make the investment, then it would have to relinquish the interest, and then it would be 100% Gmpc. So why would Gmpc have to pay Acca for something that they had given Acca in the first place? Gmpc gave up significant stake in that block in order to serve as an incentive for Acca to bring in the money to do the appraisal and development of the Pecan field.
So if Gmpc wanted to take, or the government of Ghana wanted to take 37% of the stake, which we're going to pay the $1.3 billion for, it should have ordinarily just come back to us.
Absolutely.
Without any cost.
Without any cost, because if they are not prepared to make the investment in terms of what commitments they made at the beginning. The commitments were that we are buying this interest from Hess, and they bought it at a pretty low price from Hess. It was not all the investments that Hess had made that they paid for. I think they paid $25 million, to get into that block, and then there was a kind of contingent payment that was going to be about 75 million if a plan of development was approved, which then they would have to pay to Hess. So basically 25 million. And based on that, we are now, a few years later, buying 37% for 1.3 billion. I mean, what sort of justification can you find for that situation? Frankly, I think it's very hard to justify that sort of scenario. And as I'm insisting, the legal framework, the agreements provide that if the companies which have made commitments to risk their capital to develop the resources, if they no longer wish to do that, then they walk away, like Hess. Hess didn't want to put any more money into Ghana. They had made some big discoveries in Guyana, which they were more interested in pursuing single-mindedly. So they sort of sold it almost for nothing to Acca. And now we are hearing that Acca itself is selling for $1 to the AFC, the Africa Finance Corporation. Now, I mean, frankly, again, the legal framework allows GMPC to preempt that transaction because
I see.
GMPC can say, well, if you're selling it for $1, I'm willing to pay that dollar, and on that basis, it should come to me. And so I think that there is enough in the legal framework for GNPC to be able to have a proactive role in ensuring that there is national value being realized, rather than all the time the value going outside. I think that transaction would have been a disaster because that $1 billion, I mean, it would take a long, long time for even that cost to be recovered, much less any revenue being generated, any return on that investment being generated from the Pecan field. I mean, I don't think that anybody can, convince me that there was justification in terms of energy transition. In fact, the thing about the energy transition is that it makes it more important for our national company to protect the national interest in a way that may be different from what the international companies and the international financial institutions are doing. Clearly, Acca was having difficulty in raising the money to advance its objective because these days, in the midst of energy transition and so on, financial institutions are hesitant. I mean, when you have big companies like the Exxon Mobils, the Shells and Chevrons and so on, based on their balance sheet, they are able to raise money and get on with their activity. But a company like Acca is looking to raise money, from financial institutions, and because of the energy transition situation, they're not able to, raise that money. So it seems to me that it is a question of a national company, stepping in and finding ways of raising that sort of capital to develop, as opposed to buying back a stake that they already gave in the first instance.
See, so really, GMPC did not need Acca to become an operator? Really?
No, not really, because, I mean, and in any case, we've seen since then that, Acca itself has decided to wash their hands for $1. This is something that they had earlier expressed a strong interest in developing, and on that basis, they asked for incentives to be given to them. Those incentives included sacrificing what had been part of Exploco's interest and giving it to them. A lot of concessions were made to them to make it possible for them to undertake the appraisal and development that they committed themselves to. But in the end, it has come to nothing. I mean, if we are told that some management from Acca is going to be there working with Africa Finance Corporation, I mean, GMPC is able also to find the right, team, technically the right expertise to work with it in order to undertake the development. So, I mean, having a management in place from Acca in a situation where Acca now has no risk capital involved whatsoever, I frankly think that is really an unfortunate situation.
Some say actually that some of these deals get onto the table. In fact, they get approved because of the politicization of the entire GMPC itself. And so it's one of the reasons why there has to be a review, so that the CEO who is there has the right knowledge, expertise, understands exactly the vision he or she is driving, plus the board members as well know exactly what they want to achieve with every decision they take. That's one of the reasons why they want.
Yeah, but that doesn't require changing laws. When I was running GMPC, I had a board which had, people like Dr. J.L.S. Abe, may his soul rest in peace, people like Mr. Parker, people like the former Director of Geological Survey, Mr. Banson, I mean, the people who are appointed to the board, I mean, they should be the right people who can make a contribution. That doesn't require change of the law in order for the right choices to be made. You know, in any context, choices of personnel have to be made to institutions. And I don't think it's the change in the law that, you know, makes it possible to make the right choices. You know, I think that it is always possible to make the right choices. And, you know, when we see an organization like Gmpc, which has so much potential, it should be of concern to us to ensure, and it's good that, you know, civil society organizations and so on are raising issues about, you know, some of the people in certain positions and so on, but it doesn't require change in the law in order to get those things addressed.
In fact, so that actually ties into something that happened recently. As we're talking about the personnel in there and the people in decision-making positions in a critical institution like GNPC, recently the board chair of the GNPC, Freddie Blay, who is former chairman of the ruling NPP, together with the CEO, incurred the wrath of the energy minister because of the alleged steps which were initiated to sell Jubilee Oil Holdings Limited's 50% interest in the South Deepwater Tunnel block. And the fact that the minister says that he had actually given a directive that should not be done. That transaction shouldn't take place between GMPC and the South African institution. But later found out that there has been an initial step taken by the board chair at his blind side as well. This is something I know you follow quite critically as well.
Well, I followed it not in, you know, too much detail, but there are certain intriguing aspects of that whole disputation between the minister and the board chair. I mean, starting with the board chair's position, the explanations that I have read have to do with PetroSA exercising a right of preemption in respect of the Anadarko divestiture. Now, I mean, frankly, that is a very, you know, weak kind of justification because, well, weak is actually a generous word because, I mean, the time of preemption has long passed. You know, when Anadarko was about to exit, at that time, within the group, that is Anadarko's, you know, foreign partners, at that time, what the agreement requires them to do is to indicate to the participants, their partners, their co-investors, that we want to exit, and, you know, this is maybe something has been offered to us by Total Energy or something. But if you can match it, then you can have the interest that we have. Right. Now, so at that time, if PetroSA wanted to exercise a right of preemption, they were entirely at liberty to do that. But you don't wait until a situation now where GNPC has made the acquisition, and then you say that in the name of preemption, you are selling 50%. I mean, that, again, there's no, you know, framework of preemption in this. Basically, it's an attempt to sell a 50% stake. And I think that if that's what it is, I mean, they should try to justify it in terms of the value for Ghana, of what they are trying to sell and so on. Not this argument about preemption, because frankly, the legal structure about preemption cannot be applied to that situation because the preemption situation has passed. It was a time when Anadarko was selling, and GMPC, again, under the legal framework, has its own ability to preempt. That's also independent of what the partners among themselves can do. So GMPC, under the Petroleum Exploration and Production Law, the act, is able to preempt. And they exercise that preemption. And it's interesting that tallow oil also exercised a preemption right. So part of, and they were approved to do the preemption at that time. So part of what, GMPC would have got, in the end, it was ceded to tallow at that time. So if Petro SA at that time also wanted to be part of the preempt, then they would have put forward themselves, and within that context, the preemption could have been addressed, comprehensively. Yeah, but that was in the past. So after all that is done, GMPC has a stake, and then now later you say that you're going to sell 50% of it. That's a different transaction. Essentially, it's a transaction in which you now want to sell part of the stake of GMPC, and you need to justify it as such. You don't justify it in terms of preemption and so on of Petro SA, because there's
that period had elapsed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, but you see, there's also something interesting in relation to what I read about the concerns of the minister in respect of the JOHL, Jubilee Oil Holdings Limited entity, which is registered in the Cayman Islands. And, I noted that there is a reference to some payments that are going to be made to Litasco in connection with which some commitments seem to have been made.
Between the two institutions, yes.
Exactly. So there is an attempt to protect, as it were, the payments to Litasco from, being affected by another transaction that, GMPC undertakes. Now, I think we need to know a bit more about this transaction with Litasco, because, as far as I can understand it, if the transaction is by way of like a loan to GMPC, there are issues about how consistent it is with the current legal framework in which there is a provision of, the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which requires all the receipts, all revenues, received from, oil sales and so on, to go into the Petroleum Holding Fund. Now, you can't just use an entity which is created by GNPC, but because it is put in the Cayman Islands, you can't just use that device in order to avoid doing what the law requires in terms of, payment into the Petroleum Holding Fund, out of which then various disbursements are made. That's the legal structure that we have. To be honest, I have some concerns that legal structure may sometimes be an unnecessary constraint on GMPC, but that is what we have at the moment. And I'll come back to explain what I mean by the constraints on GMPC. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the important point is that we have a clear legal framework requiring that these, sales of oil and the revenues derived therefrom should go into the Petroleum Fund. Now, if GMPC has essentially a subsidiary, because JOHL is nothing other than a subsidiary of GMPC. It was established by GMPC in order to, exercise rights in connection with the asset. Now, if GMPC finds that, it wants to raise money and there is a problem because of that provision in the law, that's the issue that again must be faced. You don't more or less go in contradiction with the law, and then you're raising money. I think Litasco is supposed to be the entity that is providing the funding, but again, is that a transparent process? Were there invitations to others to raise equivalent, funding? Because I know that there are many financial institutions, I mean, in Japan, in Germany, in Korea and so on, there are many institutions of some of these countries which are dependent on oil imports, where they are able to provide very soft long-term capital, by way of a prepayment. So, I mean, Litasco, is a private company whose terms may need to be compared with what can be obtained from elsewhere, in order to see whether that's a valid kind of, value proposition for the country. So, really, when you look at the representations, both from the chairman of GMPC and from the ministry, there are a lot of issues about which I think more explanation needs to be provided and more justification for particular transactions, because otherwise it then becomes almost as if various powerful players each have a particular transaction that they want to undertake. And, they are sort of at loggerheads in terms of the transaction that they want to take. One of the striking things also for me, especially in relation to GMPC, is that, the GMPC chairman is supposed to be a non-executive chairman. Yes. So, in this transaction, the descriptions don't suggest that he is playing a non-executive role. And that itself is a problem, And, I mean, it is possible to have an executive chairman, but at the moment, the framework...
And the framework says it's non-executive chair.
Exactly.
So cannot take part in, for instance, such decisions as to...
Well,
does he have the power to do what he...
He can be part of the board consideration and approval of what the management brings up. But in terms of the descriptions that I'm reading, where he seems to be taking the lead and, corresponding with PetroSA and so on, that is certainly not consistent with my understanding of the current legal framework that we have for GMPC. And so there are just many issues. But as I say, at the end of the day, if GMPC, was looking at a transaction of selling, 50% of the asset, they have to justify it in terms of the value that they're getting for the country, not resort to this, fictitious sort of preemption, explanation. And by the same token, if the ministry also has a transaction that it is looking to protect with Litasco, we need to understand that transaction clearly in terms of the terms on which that prepayment arrangement, yes, the terms under which that arrangement has been done, and whether there are comparable options, which could have given better value.
That's right.
So the nature of the transaction, and I mean, part of the concern that I have in this reference to Litasco is also because I recall a report of PIAC, I think around 2020, 2019, in which they again make reference to the fact that GMPC was actually compelled to make some payments for fuel supplied to car power ship by Litasco. Now, again, it was indicated that that was on the instructions of either the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Energy. And I think that is what raises one of the complications about GMPC, which have come up in various PIAC reports, that if you have GMPC essentially being seen as just an arm of government, and directives are given which are not necessarily consistent with the corporate decision-making framework of GMPC itself, then you run into issues, because that payment that GMPC made to Litasco, for instance, has been recorded by PIAC as a debt that is still unpaid to to GMPC. And that constrains GMPC. So when you have a situation where there are many debts outstanding from government to GMPC, there are debts from Ghana Gas to GMPC, there are requirements by government for GMPC to fund cocoa roads or roads in the Western Corridor and so on. And you also read that GMPC is unable to fund its share of capital calls for, say, the Sankofa Ginyami project, or GMPC is unable to act proactively to deal with the gas handling issues that are constraining oil production in the Jubilee and 10 fields, then one should be worried. So essentially what I'm saying is that there needs to be a clear appreciation that GMPC was supposed to be a commercial corporate body that operates efficiently in terms of industry norms, and that is accountable to the government and to the people of Ghana for its decision making. But if the decision making is essentially what it is instructed to do here and there, then the lines get blurred in terms of responsibility. So who is really responsible for these decisions and their consequences?
But it also goes to beg the question of how this oil discovery over the period has impacted or contributed to our development as a country. Over these 10 years, according to the PIAC report, we've made over $10 billion as a country from the oil discovery. But are there tangible investments that we can point to and say this $10 billion has been useful?
Well, first of all, I think that one should be, quite pleased with the fact that oil production has generated $10 billion worth of revenue for government in this relatively short period since, oil production came actively into the economy. Now, I think that the impact on the country, of course, depends on how those revenues are deployed. In other words, those are government decisions, which are not necessarily GMPC's responsibility, because the government decisions as to how those resources are spent is what enables us to see whether they are being rightly spent. Again, when you look at some of the PIAC reports, they give clear indications that, unfortunately, some of the decisions of the Ministry of Finance in relation to expenditures are not consistent with the order of disbursements that have been scheduled. So that is where we should be looking closely. I think the PIAC reports provide a lot of information that tells us that the disbursement of the revenues is not always consistent with either the legal framework or what might seem to be in the best interests of communities all around the country. And it seems to me that that is where a lot of focus should be. You see, because, as I said before, it's not changing the laws that will make those decisions better or worse. It is having the right decision making, by people who are committed to the national interest. And when you read accounts in which some of the disbursements that are supposed to go to certain projects, the PIAC people go there
and they don't find them.
They don't find the project.